Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the Smart Building Exchange Demystifying Digital Twin session. My name is Jeremy Richmond. I am the Director of Business Development for DB Engineering. We are an engineering technology consultancy helping owners operationalize and unlock the data within their assets. So with me today, we have three panelists that I'd like to allow them to introduce themselves. And so first, Chan, would you take a minute and let everybody know who you are?
Hi, Onechanh. I oversee our facilities here at Hollywood Park and SoFi Stadium, including sustainability, parking, transportation, landscape, groundskeeping, housekeeping, other areas, engineering as well.
Outstanding. And Robby, would you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Robby Martin. I am the Senior Customer Success Manager for Willow, and we created the digital twin of the SoFi Stadium and Hollywood Park campus, and we'll be going through that here in a little bit.
All right, outstanding. And lastly, David.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Gallagher. I am the Senior Manager of Digital Buildings at Oxford Properties. We're based out of Toronto, Canada, and we are a large owner, developer, and manager of commercial real estate globally. We've got about 300 assets. So my role is to lead the digital buildings team, and we cover everything from researching up and coming technologies to implementation of infrastructure and what we'll be talking about today, digital twins and what we do with them. Looking forward to the chat.
All right. So thank you, Dave. So for everybody who's attending, thank you for spending the next 90 minutes with us. I want to let everybody know that we do have the question and answer on your Zoom. So as a question pops up, we'll be pausing throughout the conversation today to answer those questions. So please feel free to utilize that, and we look forward to hearing what everybody has to say about this. So Robby, Chan, I understand you guys have a PowerPoint presentation that walk us through what you guys have been doing specifically with SoFi Stadium.
We do, Jeremy, and thanks for having us today. I'm going to ask Chan to help me out during this presentation. We only have about 14 or 15 slides. Again, put those questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get around to them either during the presentation or shortly after. To start off with, I just wanted to give a quick intro to SoFi Stadium and just the Hollywood Park in general area. It's quite an impressive venue. I encourage you, if you're ever in the LA area, or you're even outside the LA area, make the trip to SoFi Stadium, see a Rams game or Chargers game, concert. They have, I think, events going on most of the days of the year, so you can usually find something to your taste. But it's a 70,000 seat, $5 billion stadium is the main attraction of the Hollywood Park area. There's an adjacent 6,000 seat YouTube theater, which is where a lot of the concerts are held. There's also an NFL media building on campus. And just, in doing the digital modeling of this building, we discovered there's about 340 kilometers of cable conduit, so about half the length of the state of California. So it's one of the most technologically advanced stadiums in the world. There are more kind of interesting, cool features, property technology on site than we could, even imagine to talk through in an hour and a half that we have for this session. Chan, are there any specific features or interesting facts about the stadium that you'd like to call out?
I think you covered a lot of the points and topics, but the stadium, as you mentioned, does sit on a 300-acre site that we call Hollywood Park. The stadium sits in the center. That it's really the anchor piece for the entire project that's being developed. And then we have the 25-acre of lake wetland that's included as part of the site and that what we manage. And so a lot of construction still taking place on site, a lot of new projects, commercial, retail, development taking place as we're operating the stadium.
Perfect. Thanks, Chen. So Willow got involved with Hollywood Park about 3 years ago. And one of the reasons that we were brought in is because the CTO at the time, Scarpy Hiddenson, knew that some of the traditional methods around the construction and building process of what was going to be the most technologically advanced stadium in North America, if not the world, was going to require some new technology to help in the construction process, but also in the day-to-day operations and running of the building. So as he said, knowing how incredibly complex these modern buildings are, it's really starting to strain the traditional methods that we have used to manage and maintain and operate these buildings. And so tools like digital twins, I think, will become necessary for stadiums, for venues, and for other complex public assembly venues. I think it'll be absolutely critical. And so I kind of want to mention or talk about first what is Willow and what is a digital twin. And this is a topic that we'll get into kind of throughout the day. And I think it's really important to level set with the definition of what we think a digital twin is. So at Willow, we say a digital twins are virtual representations of physical assets overlaid with real-time information from devices, equipment, people, and places. And this is really important, that they are virtual representations of physical assets. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a virtual replication of that asset. So in the instance of the SoFi Stadium, we did create a accurate virtual replication of the stadium, I think down to the quarter inch, where we have every seat, every structural element, every lighting fixture incorporated into this 3D model of the stadium. And that's really important because one of the first use cases that we wanted to enable was for the stadium engineers and operators to be able to locate where assets were in such a massive complex, right? So if you're going into a room, whether it's a VIP suite or whether it's an electrical room, you want to be able to give those operators that ability to see behind the walls and see where the access panel was that they needed to get to locate that piece of equipment. So, but you can also think of digital twins as virtual representations in other ways. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a true to form 3D BIM model of the space. So it could be represented through a dashboard. It could be represented through a piece of information that you're gaining from these digital systems. So we'll talk a little bit about what type of systems that we integrated with SoFi Stadium. But first, I wanted to talk about the technology that I think I'm really excited about that's really just come across in the past few months that's enabled some of these really interesting use cases at SoFi Stadium. So one of the things that we use within Willow is called rec ontology within the digital twin definition language. So this is a free ontology, much like a brick or haystack naming schema, but we use it in a little bit different way. So instead of a linear like database type model where you're going from point to point, we use a graph data model to add this metadata type information to our assets and to our live data points. So what that means is we can start to put stuff like what is feeding a piece of equipment and what room that piece of equipment is located in, and what is fed by that piece of equipment to enable some really unique use cases that go above and beyond just where does this asset sit in the building. So you can kind of think of it like a neural network almost, where instead of going from A to B to C, now we can look at a problem from this graph database model and get to these solutions a lot quicker with all this data kind of built into the background here. So within that rec ontology, again, what we're looking for are things like what capabilities pieces of equipment have. So layering in that live data and starting to find some of those unique applications when you do layer in that live data. So a good example would be, if a room is too hot or too cold, but we layer in that occupancy data and we can see that there are, perhaps no occupants in that room, then maybe it's okay if that room is too hot or too cold. And we can save money, save energy, and contribute to the the overall comfort of the space. So when we talk about the Willow twin at SoFi Stadium, it's probably the largest digital twin built to date. We have 1,740 3D models from the design and construction teams across 58 different disciplines incorporated into the digital twin. So that includes over 143,000 assets that we've modeled and over 110,000 live data points connected from 10 of the most vital 25 systems. So the reason that we chose, if you're familiar with building technology, you might say 110,000 points, you could get that out of just the BMS alone. And the reason that we have 110,000 points is because we've chosen the points that we see as the most vital to the makeup of the building. So, we didn't want to create a ton of insights, create a ton of rules or data that doesn't get analyzed, doesn't get used. So we picked the 110 most vital points to bring into our system to model into the digital twin. Within that 110 live data points, we're modeling all the HVAC data from the BMS systems, the stadium and the performance venue energy metering systems. Kind of one of the interesting, again, use cases of the digital twin here is that each building within Hollywood Park, the stadium and the performance venue have their own BMS and they have their own energy metering system. So one of the pieces of functionality that we aim to give to the stadium is to say, hey, instead of having to switch between your different BMSs to view information about your HVAC from the stadium and from the performance venue, now you can see that all on one screen. You can compare these different pieces of equipment against each other, against different events, against different weather patterns, all of that in one piece of software. We also integrated the roof panels. So I think they have 43 movable roof panels at the stadium. And we also integrated with Google BigQuery. So we wanted to make sure that the data isn't locked into another silo. We understand that the industry was really built upon these data silos originally, where the BMS was very concerned with keeping their data in that realm, same with the energy data. So we wanted to make sure that the stadium had access to their data and was able to bring that data into a form that they were able to create their own dashboards if they needed to. So again, they can go to Google Looker using that BigQuery integration, pull what data they needed from the twin. It's all tagged using that DTDL rec ontology tagging schema, so they can quickly access the data points that they need to create their own dashboards. We also have a work order management system integration, so we can start to track things like where in the building they're getting the most work orders, and even other unique integrations like, okay, if we see that we have a lot of work orders for this specific area, can we start to overlay other information from the energy system or from the BMS to see if there's any correlations between that data. We also created a custom driver for the stadium lighting. So this is one of the kind of interesting integrations here. Most people are familiar with BACnet or Modbus to connect to data, but the stadium is really an interesting scenario because we had different live systems with different drivers that we weren't necessarily used to from the building industry. So in this case, the protocol that the lighting system was talking was called streaming ACN. And at that point in time, there was no direct protocol converter from streaming ACN to a BACnet or to a Modbus or something that you would typically use to read the data. So working with the company out of Canada, I believe called Chipkin, we developed a device driver that would convert that protocol, that language from streaming ACN to BACnet. As we went along, we found some other use cases. So they wanted to be able to do like warranty tracking. So understanding what pieces of equipment, once they had the digital twin, had their warranty expiration periods coming up. So they could, track the maintenance of those pieces of equipment, see whether they're in or out of warranty. So overall, in summary, again, we've aggregated via custom dashboards and custom integrations over 10 live data sources, along with that 3D accurate representation of Hollywood Park, both the performance venue and the stadium. We've also custom built a rules engine, fault detection diagnostics that can provide insights about what's going on at the stadium. And yeah, again, modeled over 143,000 static assets in that 3D environment. Chan, I know I did a lot of the talking there. I'm more than happy to go back to a couple slides if you'd like to add any points or add anything here, but I know we'll also get to some of the questions here in the panelist section where we'll go back over some of this stuff as well.
Yeah, I was waiting for some questions. I mean, I think you covered a lot from the slides. We have a large building here of 3 million square feet, and when we were constructing the building and when we talked to Scarpy, the CTO at the time, and the technology was presented to us, there was something that we thought we could benefit from. And so we're using it today a lot on the visual side as we continue to connect the data assets and kind of work through all those systems and how we utilize the twin moving forward.
Yeah, one of the things I was most excited about with the SoFi Stadium is that it really presents so many opportunities to work with different user groups and different kind of prop tech systems to find value and find these use cases. So not only do we have Chan's team, which is focused on, like Chan said, sustainability and operations. We also have things like parking and the engineering team and the security team, guest relations team and sales team. So it's kind of fun to work with these different user groups to find, hey, we can use the digital twin to, show potential clients who are looking at renting a suite, what that suite layout looks like currently and how wide the doorways are if they need to bring in equipment or tables, and talking with the sustainability team about different ways that we could start to track things like the waste streams. So as long as there's a data source for it, we can bring it into the twin. And the goal is to always tie it back to that kind of that definition that we were talking about, where we're tying it back into the static information and the static twin that we're getting that we have set up with the building information. So that's been one of the most exciting parts about building the twin here.
So Robby, I wanted to ask something on one of your slides. It might have been the one before this one, before that. You had the work order integration right there, right? So you got the work order management integration, and I think a lot of folks who may be attending here today think of that work order integration as strictly like a break fix. There's something needs to go to facilities, something's going to Chan's team to go out and resolve and repair. Are you guys seeing advantages of having your work order integration for those other user groups that you were just talking about?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. It's good to clarify too that in this case we're not trying to replace the work order management system with something that's native into the digital twin. What we're really trying to do is tie those work orders that are created against assets, trying to tie that back into the history of that asset. So again, if the digital twin is that repository for not only all the drawings and the O&M manuals and the live data about that asset, but also now we can start to capture the history of that asset. So, how many times have we had to go out and do maintenance on this piece of equipment? When was the last time? Who was the last person who worked on it? And what were the comments they made and the notes that they made? So I think that's really the goal, is to capture that history of the asset so that now we can start to track, okay, if we've had to do a lot of maintenance on this piece of equipment, tied in with, okay, we're looking at the electrical data from the live data feed. Do we predict that we now need to replace that piece of equipment sooner based on this other information? Did I hit that right, Chan?
Yeah, just going back to the idea of this single pane of glass. For myself, the way I currently use the twin is going to that dashboard and then looking at all the work orders and then, kind of matching that up to the faults as well as the other areas, basically allowing me to really just log into one software program versus going into our BMS, going into our work order, going into our set of drawings located in another location is really a one-stop shop for kind of trying to figure out in real time what's happening with the building and then what areas we're looking at and what we're researching in terms of issues that may arise.
That's thanks for that context. I think it's great for operators to be able to come to a single interface, be able to see what's going on, be able to see those histories, and gain that information so that they can go out and perform something better, know that something was already looked at, and to go look at the next thing down the line. So thank you for that. So we do have a couple questions coming in, but I would like to maybe hold on to a couple of these until we get through the other presentation as well, and then address some of those, because I think some of these may be applicable to both. So Robby, Chan, was there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about with SoFi Stadium here?
Not on my end. Looking forward to answering some of the questions and going through some of the topics in the panel discussion.
Absolutely. So thank you everybody for the questions that have come in. Keep them coming, and we'll hand this over to David.
All right, thanks, Jeremy, and great presentation there, Robby and Chen. Just share my screen in a second here. Let me know if there's any trouble viewing.
Oh, looking good, Dave.
All right, perfect. Just gonna minimize my video. Here we go. All right, so demystifying digital twins. Let's jump right in. Quick agenda here. I'm going to talk a bit about Oxford Properties, since we may not be familiar to everyone on the call. I'll talk about our strategy and why digital twins. I'll talk about applications of digital twins and then getting started. And throughout this will be bits and pieces of what we're doing in building digital twins as well. So about us. We are a global real estate investor, asset manager, operator, and builder of real estate businesses. We span 4 continents and 7 sectors with a portfolio of over 300 assets. So we have a portfolio worth about $80 billion US, total square footage, 164 million square feet. We grow some pretty good returns, so about 10% if you look at the long-term sort of 10 to 20 year average returns, and we're owned by a pension fund called OMERS. In terms of our portfolio breakdown by assets under management, our biggest portfolios are in the US as well as Canada. We have a growing portfolio in UK and Europe and also in Asia. In terms of the biggest asset classes, it's definitely office, industrial, and retail. I joined the company about 13 years ago, and I've seen global expansion as well as a shift in our portfolio. So when I joined, most of our portfolio was in Canada, and it was just office. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'll show you some of our assets here from the different portfolios or different asset classes. This one here is the Stack in Vancouver. This is a new development that's going up right now. It should be handed over later this fall. This picture really doesn't do it justice, but I think I have another one later on in the presentation. We also have hotels here. So if you ever get out to British Columbia, this one is the Fairmont Chateau Whistler, beautiful property. We have new life sciences asset class as well. This one's in Boston, 645 Summer. So life sciences is an asset class that we're expanding in. We also have industrial, which I think you saw was a large part of our portfolio and growing. We have retail. This is a mall here in Toronto called Square One. And this picture really doesn't do the mall justice because it's about 3 million square feet. And we also have residential. So this is Alto 57 in New York. So all that to say, we've got some pretty big assets around the world. And I should mention that not all of these assets are directly managed by Oxford. So in North America, for the office and retail portfolios, we generally manage these properties, but outside of those regions, we generally rely on third-party facility managers. So that makes the discussion of digital twins and why sort of really interesting. But before I get into the why, I'll talk a little bit about our digital twin journey. So I started with Oxford in 2010, and I'd say that we've been on sort of a constant evolution of digital twins. Although back when I joined, I didn't really know what I was working on was really a digital twin. But to explain a little bit about that, my very first project when I started was to implement an energy management software across our Canadian portfolio. So we used a software called EFT, and part of that project was to install energy submeters across all of our buildings to be able to collect real-time information. And that project was a big success, apart from the fact that you can put this sort of software in place, you can create visualizations, you can have all that data sitting there, but in order to get people to do something with that information, it actually takes a lot of finesse and it's a bit of an art. So we very quickly learned by 2012, late 2012, that in order to get people to look at this sort of data, you can't just expect them to log into software. You actually need to sort of gamify the approach. So that's where creating sort of these predictive energy models came in, and we were able to gamify and get people to look at this information. And I'll talk a bit about the change management later on as well. Fast forward to 2014, we evolved from EFT to some of you might know Enernoc, which is another energy management platform. I think they've changed names several times since then. But at that point, we merged sort of the utility bill collection with what they call EIS, which is a platform that tracks the energy submeters within Enernoc. Fast forward to 2017, we got even more sophisticated in our approach. We implemented a platform called Switch Automation across 21 buildings in Canada. And that really did what's known as fault detection and diagnostics. So pulling more than just submeter data, actually connecting to automation systems, pulling a lot of the data from fans, pumps, et cetera, and running analytics on that to tell us where things were broken and where things could be optimized. Then fast forward to 2022, now we're working on actual sort of what I'd call digital twins, looking at how we can pull telemetry data from all of our buildings for purposes broader than just energy management or equipment optimization. So in terms of our strategy, you might ask why? Why is this of interest to us? Well, as a bit of context here, we're building a world-class portfolio. In my time at Oxford, I've seen our portfolio more than double. We went from just Canada-based to international. And in fact, I think the growth isn't going to slow down anytime soon. But as we scale, our mission really is to maximize our return. What that means for us as a real estate company is increase net operating income, NOI, and ultimately grow the asset value. And if we can do that in sort of a socially responsible and sustainable way, that's even better. But I'd say despite our accomplishments in scaling the portfolio, we face a growing number of challenges. And these challenges sort of change day to day. So number one, I think everyone's familiar with are the economic conditions. So the COVID pandemic impact is one that we're all familiar with. That certainly had a big impact on our business, especially the shift to working from home. We're also seeing a lot of up and coming ESG pressures. So especially as we expand into sort of other parts of the world in Europe, we're seeing very strict regulations that require us to report on our energy and emissions. And we're also setting net zero carbon targets as well. So for us, it's a matter of sort of mitigating that challenge. We also see a great deal of operational risk. So as we acquire buildings, sometimes the front of house looks great, but you go back of house and you can see the mechanical rooms are not in such great shape. Or from an operational technology perspective, there's a lot of risk that we see. And that stems beyond just equipment, that can also extend into cybersecurity as well. And then lastly, we're seeing disruption in terms of prop tech. So as the industry changes and new technologies come about, we have to look for ways of embedding these technologies within the business. And along with that comes also changing customer demands or tenant expectations. So taking all those things into account, we believe that digital building capabilities will help us to mitigate these challenges and ultimately maximize our return. So instead of seeing prop tech as a threat, we feel that we should embrace it and actually look for ways to help us optimize our business. That's really backed by sort of three things or four things we believe. One is tenants we expect will expect these sort of capabilities from leading landlords. So digital amenities and digital ways of interacting with our buildings. We think that buyers and co-owners and investors will require sort of technology and data and capabilities from our buildings when they go to buy. We think it will provide us with a competitive advantage in operating our assets, especially data and analytics. We also think if we can do this across a portfolio, it will be a brand differentiator. So the question is, how do we do that? We think that data and interoperability are key to unlocking value. So if you take, for example, one of our newest buildings, EY Tower, which is the building I'm in right now, we have approximately 2,500 devices, everything spanning from HVAC to IoT sensors. That equates to about 20,000 data points per minute. The question is, how do we take all of that data, which is currently locked within the building today and nobody's looking at it, and all of the interoperable capabilities that come with this sort of new smart building, and how do we find value from both an external and internal stakeholder perspective? So how do we enable digital amenities for our customers, for our visitors, for our occupants, and how do we use data to ultimately drive better decisions in how we operate and maintain the facility? So we think that the path to value includes a few things. Number one is future-proof cybersecurity infrastructure. So just ensuring that all of the systems that we put into our buildings, whether we're upgrading or building new, are at a common standard and they're able to give us data, but they're also interoperable. We also think that digital twins are key to unlocking that data and interoperability. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The third thing for us is services. So once we have access to those systems and that data, what do we run in terms of services, in terms of digital amenities and analytics that help to optimize our buildings and enhance the customer experience? And then lastly, I think the piece that not a lot of people talk about, but is very important, is having people and process aligned to that technology. So as I said, just because you have a piece of technology in place or you have data and analytics, doesn't mean that you're actually going to affect change. It's all about how you get your teams to look at this information, adopt the technology, and use it at the end of the day. In terms of digital twin maturity and defining digital twins, I think our definition of a twin is a virtual sort of, I like Robby's definition, representation of a physical asset. But we also think that there's core capabilities. So at the very basic level, it's about having a data model to map asset elements, and it's about having exploratory tools. At the next level up, it's about real-time telemetry and descriptive analytics, so understanding how your asset is performing based on real-time data. Beyond that, for us, it's about predictive analytics. So not only knowing how the asset's performing now, but how is it going to perform at some point in the near future. We think as well there's an element of feedback control or manual control to allow us to control the asset. And at the highest level, it's all about autonomous operations. So having a twin simulate, take in today's data, predict the future, and send automatic control signals back into the building. I do think that that is some time away, maybe next sort of 5 years or so at the earliest, but we're starting to see bits and pieces of that come up in the market. Big question everyone has is, where does the spatial model fit into this? I think for us, we focus on a data model first and data model with telemetry, but I also think that a spatial model can fit in anywhere along this maturity scale. So it's more or less, how do you want to embed a spatial model within the twin? How are you going to use it? And ultimately, what value does it bring? Next section. So in terms of applications here, our day one focus is on sort of three things. The first is around optimizing operations and maintenance. So using real-time telemetry to optimize the way in which we operate the buildings, how we maintain them, how we procure goods and services, and ultimately how we plan for capital. The second is around enabling digital amenities. So for example, if you have sub-meters on every floor of an office building, can you link that to a customer app that can show them real-time energy consumption or air quality or even people counts on the floor? And then thirdly, I think if you can do the first two properly and hit that out of the park, you can also then report on how well your building is performing. And that ultimately wraps up into this bucket of ESG. So using real-time data and using actual data to prove the performance of your asset as opposed to just an annual sort of sustainability scorecard or report. I think as we move to more and more technology, that's one of the things that this data will sort of enable. More broadly too, I think with digital twins, you know, a lot of people think of the twins as just sort of affecting or impacting the existing buildings or, you know, how they operate. But I think we think about this more broadly, and that spans the life cycle of a building itself, all the way from new developments and how we design and build and commission, you know, the handover process and the warranty process, all the way through to disposition and acquisition. When it comes to existing buildings, we talked about this a bit, but I think there's huge opportunity to use real-time data and telemetry information to do things like better capital planning, to procure better goods and services for the building, to enable digital amenities for the customers. In terms of disposition and acquisition, I think just having a building with up-to-date technology and future-proof sort of technology in the building can possibly command a higher price for the building, but also things like due diligence assessments. I think at some point in the future, buyers and investors are going to say, show us the actual data, show us how this building is performing, show us the history. It's no different than if you were to go to buy a used car, and if it came with all of its service records, you know, you might pay a little bit more just knowing that you're going to have peace of mind that that car has been well maintained. I don't think it's really anything different for a building, although I haven't really seen this just yet, but I think it's one of the things that this data can sort of enable. In terms of examples of what we're doing, we've built sort of a basic twin, I would say, a pilot at a couple of buildings, and that results in information that can allow us to understand how the building is performing from a number of different areas. So here you can see a snippet of that. We can calculate an overall comfort metric from the building. We can calculate a connectivity score of the data. We can calculate an equipment KPI, so how well is the equipment performing. We can see how long the equipment is in a fault condition as well. And we can also see how many data points and floors and tenants are associated with that building and that data. Digging one step deeper, we can get into, if you take the equipment KPI as an example, we can get into how well is the actual equipment performing. So if you have data flowing in and you have rules applied to all the equipment, you can very quickly see which pieces of equipment you should be able to focus on. And again, this is nothing new, but I think when you start to layer on this sort of information with people and process, and you think about different ways of maintaining the building or driving better contracts with your vendors, that then becomes very powerful. Example 2 for new developments. So one thing that we see a lot of with our new developments is, and I'm sure this is no different in the industry, today there's a lot of partial commissioning happening. So as soon as the building gets handed over to operations, it's not uncommon for us to see hundreds of deficiencies from day one. And when you sort of lift the hood on that and ultimately go back to the vendors, two things sort of happen. The vendors say, oh, you know, it's out of warranty, we're out of here, or they start pointing the finger of blame at each other. You know, I'm not responsible for this, it's actually that vendor. And rightfully so. I mean, sometimes it's not always easy to figure out where the problem is coming from. But one thing is for sure, it's generally operations that picks up the cost of remediation. So I think tomorrow, what we'll start to see is digital twins being implemented with new construction, and the twins actually being used to commission the building itself. So moving from a partial commissioning to more of what I'd call digital commissioning or monitoring-based commissioning, actually using the data from the building itself to commission the building and verify that it's been built according to spec and operating according to the design engineer sequence of operation. So one example here is actually from the stack, and by the way, that's the full picture of the stack in Vancouver that will be handed over later this year. We're working with a digital twin platform called Code Labs. So what they're doing is actually acting as a digital twin platform as well as the MSI. And step one is really taking all of the drawings and the design of the building and digitizing that, putting it into their platform so we know how many meters are expected to be in the building, you know, how many lights, how many pieces of equipment on the BMS. And as we work through the implementation and installation of these devices, they have sort of a checklist where they can see, have we received the drawings? Are we waiting on more information? Has that device been connected? And ultimately, has it been tested and commissioned properly? So there's a series of views that we can see within the software to tell us effectively what the completion of that building is from a physical perspective, but also from a commissioning perspective. The thing I'd like to point out here, though, is, again, the technology is just a tool. You have to know how to use the technology and how to look at this data and how to ultimately change the way in which the vendors are used to working in order to make this very effective. And that really is one of the biggest challenges with this sort of technology. But we are finding that this approach of digital commissioning is very promising. Last section here. So in terms of getting started, come up with a list of do's and don'ts if you're looking to get into this sort of digital twin space. I'd say first thing you don't want to do is get caught up in the hype. There's a lot of platforms out there. There's a lot of slick sort of salespeople trying to get you sucked in. And ultimately, if you buy a platform and go straight to implementation, I think you'll be sorely disappointed with the results. And that sort of loops into the second point here. Don't jump to installing gateways right away, and don't expect data to flow immediately. And I'll get into that in a slide or two, but effectively you have to understand how your buildings are actually operating today, what their current capabilities are to give you sort of information. And, oftentimes we see when we do show up and just install a gateway, you don't see anything, or data doesn't flow, or you just uncover a ton of issues. The last thing you don't want to do is think that technology itself will result in value, because it doesn't. You can get lots of data, you can get lots of slick visualizations, but ultimately it's about how you embed that within the organization to drive value. What I would say in terms of do's, do take the time to figure out your strategy. Do define the outcomes you're looking for and think about that first. Do take the time to pilot and test different platforms, deciding on the one you're going to go with. Do take the time to socialize the program internally. So with this stuff, it's all very brand new, and we're finding that there's a big wall of resistance sort of internally. So it's about educating and informing your colleagues and the organization of why this is important. And ultimately, sometimes it's about helping them to understand why using this information and doing their jobs differently will result in a better outcome. The last thing I'd say is work with an experienced partner. This is not something you want to jump in and figure out yourself. I personally have, and it's taken me a few years to get to this point, but I think there's a lot of great consultants and vendors out there who have done this before who can help you on this journey. In terms of process, I'll go through this pretty quickly, but there's sort of 5 steps that I see. First one is around setting the strategy. So what's the problem you're solving? What are the outcomes you're looking for? Ultimately, who are the users? Who do you expect to be using this information or a digital twin platform? Once you have that defined, you can start jumping into what are the requirements. So what sort of analytics do you want to see? What sort of integrations? What are the functional and non-functional requirements? Step 3 is around platform selection. So for us specifically, this comes down to, do we buy a turnkey solution? Do we build this in-house? What are the cybersecurity considerations, and ultimately piloting before we go full scale on anything. I'll talk about implementation in the next couple of slides, but ultimately you want to figure out which buildings go first, which buildings are capable. And then the last point here around use is not one that people generally think about, but if you have this sort of platform in place, you have all this data at your fingertips, what are you going to do in terms of training? How are you going to adopt this into the organization? How are you going to support it? So from a data and data pipeline perspective, don't just assume that this thing is going to work 24/7, but how are you actually going to maintain it and ensure that you continue to get data? And then lastly, also, how are you going to demonstrate value? I found that oftentimes these sorts of technologies can fail if you're not actually documenting the value that it's bringing on an ongoing basis. In terms of requirements, I'll just speak briefly to this slide here, but in our own sort of journey here in research, we've defined 6 day 1 capabilities for a digital twin. And these are quite broad in terms of capabilities, but I think this generally applies to anyone kind of going along this journey. First, you need a tool that's going to integrate to systems. You then need a tool that stores that data. You need a tool that normalizes it. You need a way to visualize that information. run analytics, and ultimately a tool that can be interoperable. So if you wanted to plug and play an application that's on the market, you shouldn't have to install another gateway in the building. Your twin should be able to do that for you. This is just our approach, I should say. You might have a different approach. In terms of how we do this, and I've got a couple of slides left here. Step one is really around infrastructure assessments. So as I said, don't just walk up to a building and assume you can install a gateway. What you really want to do is assess your building stock and understand what systems you have in your buildings and what capability they have to give you data. So for this, we worked with DB Engineering actually to assess all of our buildings, go through system by system, and kind of give us an on-paper look at which buildings we think are ready. This is very useful, but I would say this isn't the last step. The next step is actually doing what I'd call a diagnostic scan. So based on the results of your assessment in step one, go deep on the buildings that you think are ready to be digital twins. What you want to do here is actually scan those networks. And a lot of the things we find are unresponsive devices. We find duplicate device IDs. We find a whole lot of broadcast storms, generally things that point to our systems not being set up necessarily properly from the get-go or not being maintained. But it's absolutely necessary if you're going to add on another platform that's extracting data or integrating with these systems to do this sort of diagnostic scan and almost like a controls tune-up of your building. If not, you can generally run into problems. And if you want to know what some of those problems are, I'm happy to chat about those after. But once you do these steps and sort of remediate these items, then you're ready for integration. In terms of my closing thoughts here, there's three things I think you should consider. Number one is start with your strategy. So don't jump to implementation of a digital twin. Don't just buy something off the shelf and expect that it's going to work. At the end of the day, the digital twin is a tool. You still need to align that with people and process. And ultimately, it comes down to change management, especially for us. So educating and informing your colleagues, bringing them up to speed on what this technology is, why it's important, and also understanding the way in which buildings are designed, operated, and bought and sold. I think if you can figure that out first and adapt the technology to that, that's really the sweet spot where you're going to find value. With that, that is my presentation. I will hand it back to Jeremy and look forward to answering any questions.
All right, Dave, thank you for that. And so we did have a question come in here a little bit ago as you were going over the KPIs and the analytic examples. And the question was around how do you get your people to take action? And I think you touched on it there at the end. And I'm wondering if maybe if you could go a little deeper on the change management and the people and process perspective of what is required in order to start down that journey to institute that change.
Yeah. What I would say is, unfortunately, there isn't one straight path to that. I think you really have to understand your organization. There are a set of quick tips and tricks, hacks, if you will, that can help. I think number one, it goes back to socialization. You want to socialize what you're doing, what the technology is. Oftentimes, when we speak to operators about a new technology, they can get really defensive even before anything's in the building or before they see any data. It's like, big brother's watching me. So you really want to get people on board and get them sort of inspired and excited about this stuff, get them wanting to ask for it. Beyond that, I think there's a couple things you can do. One is training. So just ensure that people are trained on this sort of technology and the data and what you want them to do with it. The second thing is find a way to incentivize. So, set a target, offer some sort of reward, whether that be a bonus, whether that be, a spotlight award, whatever that may be. That drives people to action. And then the third thing I've seen personally is, sites and buildings are naturally competitive. So if you can make these results transparent and almost show like a leaderboard, naturally it starts to inspire competition. So if I see my colleague across the street is doing better than me, I'm going to pull up my socks and want to do better. But ultimately this comes down to understanding, your organization, how it operates, who these individuals are. It's almost like you need to understand psychology a bit too. What are the most effective mechanisms for getting them to adopt and utilize the sort of technology and the data that it brings?
I couldn't agree more on that. Robby, Chan, on, for what did you guys go through as far as, or did you guys run into any adoption issues or getting into people to take action on the insights that were being created from the platform?
Yeah, I think adoption is key. There's just, David mentioned it really well. It's just the education, the knowledge of what the digital twin is, the definition of it. I think right back to what this presentation is, it's a demystifying and giving people a understanding. I think in our industry, a lot of folks don't have the digital twin or the twin as a frame of reference to what they've done before prior to working on this project. We didn't even think about it in the very early state of the building construction and planning. It was much later where we decided we were going to go forward with this project in terms of the digital twin piece of it. And then, getting people to, it's disruptive to what they've done prior in their work history or in their work life. So getting people past that is a challenge, and then really letting people understand what the twin is. It's kind of like, I go back to our sustainability aspect too. A lot of people say, they ask about our sustainability program, but it's much broader. The term sustainability is really broad depending on what part of the industry you're from or what aspect of the operation that you work in. It means a different definition for the food service staff, means a different definition for the housekeeping staff and the engineering staff. So getting people on the same page in that. And then really important as well, as David mentioned, is maintaining, getting support and training people on how to use it, because it is new and it's disruptive and it's a little invasive to what they're doing. Is that educational piece and really understanding. We try to roll it out to a lot of different use cases. In the beginning, this was an IT kind of engineering tool to be able to manage the building, but we realized we could use it in other ways. And so when we started presenting that, people were curious, people wanted to use it, but there is some training there that needs to be done in regards to navigating the model and then the software that's included.
Yeah, and Jeremy, part of what we do just from the training aspect is try to focus less on the traditional software training, which is, here's what clicking this button does, here's what clicking that button does, and focus more on the use cases that drive the use of the product. So, say you get someone calling you from the guest suite, in the north end, and they say there's a leak coming through their ceiling. How would you use the digital twin to do some investigation to find the source of that leak, find what size ladder you need to take out to reach the shutoff valve, where the shutoff valve is actually located. So using real world examples to drive that training of the twin, I think is really important. But also just from the kind of the manufacturer of the twin's perspective, one of the things that we try to do from our product itself is try to make the twin that useful tool, as Chan mentioned, kind of that single pane of glass, and it's a really overused term in the industry, but really we want to drive that use in the tool itself so that when something happens, people aren't having to log in and out of 3 or 4 different pieces of software to investigate the BIM model, see the energy flow data, log the work order. It can all be done in one place. So part of what we do around the product design is try to make that a seamless process. So if there's a fault that's brought up in the fault detection engine, you're one button click away from creating a work order that's related to that fault. The asset and that asset history is automatically tagged along there with that fault. So whoever goes to investigate that work order can see that history. Just trying to create the software that becomes more and more seamless so that it is your daily driver for the operators to use.
Yeah, and I think one of the other pieces about this that that I've really taken away just in my own experiences with twins is that a lot of times, and Chan, you've mentioned this, that it started around one focus around IT and engineering, and David, I know you kind of mentioned it that it also started around fault detection, or started around energy meters, and then it was fault detection, utility bill gathering, and then fault detection, and it's kind of evolved over time. A lot of time these the twin becomes you start thinking about how else you can use this data in other areas of the business, whether that's like Chan mentioned with with food service, or whether that's with sustainability, whether that's with procurement. I mean, there's a lot of different stakeholders that can gain access to this data once they have it. So there's another question that came in here that I'd like to answer, and I'll toss this one over to you, Robby and Chan first, because it came in when you guys were talking about tagging and DTDL and REC and your extension, and how that's kind of growing. But there was a question about how do you was there a special process that you used to kind of map that data point to whatever it ended up living as in the twin? Did you look at using machine learning models? Was it lookup tables? Was it was there an easy process? Was there an easy button? Or how has that gone for you?
Boy, we wish there was an easy button. I mean, I think Jeremy, you and David both know this kind of the struggle around tagging, and that where we're at in the industry right now, it requires a lot of kind of human oversight and human eyes, especially when you're trying to associate that much extra information around an asset. So you have to have someone or some system, if it's a computer ML type thing, that knows and can read like a one-line diagram and see, okay, this circuit breaker is feeding this disconnect switch, and that disconnect switch is going to that air handler unit. And so that requires quite a bit of knowledge and information. There's quite a few companies out there that are trying to solve that problem. And we've done this enough, and this is kind of it goes back to the scales. Once you do things enough like this, you do find shortcuts, whether it's lookup tables, whether it's different tools that you use. So I would say right now, the state that we're in is it's a combination of both kind of rudimentary tools like Excel and humans, but we're certainly looking, and we understand the amount of time savings that can be gained around AI or machine learning driven tools. And we understand that really since the digital twin, and Davey did a great job of explaining this about how it's really built on the data. Like you have to have that core building block of solid data, no matter what future use cases, sustainability, guest relations, tenant experience, all that, you have to come back to, you got to know your data is solid. And so, the tagging of that data and the ontology of that data cannot be more important. And so I think that's where we have some room to grow in this industry is how do we make sure we get the data tagged correctly, accurately, and not just at the beginning, but continuously. Because how many times does a device setting get changed out in the field, and we have to have models that can pick up on that change and then make that change corresponding back in the digital twin.
So absolutely, what I would refer to as like the move edge change process, in commercial real estate, these assets, if an owner is lucky enough to not have an owner occupier, but a tenant that decides to stay in that one building and never do a TI in their space for 20 years, and always pay their rent on time, that's a tenant everybody wants to have. But so these assets change, right? They evolve. And so being able to capture those changes as these assets grow over time is super important. David, on the ontology side, for you, is there a certain is there a winner in the market? Is it brick? Is it haystack? Is it DTDL? Is it DBO? I mean, it seems like we're getting almost ontologies all over the place, and like what the building automation industry did, where we tried to standardize, and all of a sudden we ended up with 20 different flavors of communication protocols. What do you see as that path forward on the ontology from a, and I guess maybe from a strategy and implementation perspective, that we could share to the others who are thinking about this journey? Maybe they're on it, or they're thinking about going down that road. Where from an ontology perspective, what do they need to be concerned about?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not really an expert on the finite details of ontologies, but just based on what I've seen so far, I think any ontology that's sort of brick-based is probably the way to go. And I think latest news, Brick and Rec are sort of aligning together and sort of forming a partnership there. I think ultimately any ontology you use, you'll have to customize somewhat. I challenge any of the ontologies out there to take our portfolio and just apply it and see if that works out of the box. I guarantee you it will not happen. So I think if your portfolio is big enough, you will require some customization at the end of the day. But in my opinion, anything that's sort of brick-based will probably serve you well into the future for now.
Awesome. And it'll be interesting to see how the ontologies merge and how the major manufacturers of these products make their data more interoperable. I think from a standards perspective, being able to institute where possible, not always possible. So we're talking greenfield scenarios, brand new buildings, new design, being able to institute standards, to push those standards down. That helps out with any kind of automation and machine learning models you want to do in the future, as far as being able to make that data easier to map as things move forward. So bringing this back, we've got a couple more questions in here, but I think we'll answer them as we go through some more of the panel. One of my favorite questions that I always get asked or ask is, everybody's definition of the digital twin. And I think we've kind of answered it here a little bit, that it can be a little bit hidden almost at times, that it's getting data, it's getting it at a certain fidelity, getting it at a certain time interval, and being able to apply it directly towards a use case. And those use cases grow over time. And so, as a journey, if we think about, there may be folks on this call here who haven't even started down this road yet. They don't know what if I got to start tomorrow, what's the one thing I need to start planning out first? David, what would you say is the most important piece down that road?
I wouldn't say there's maybe just one. There's a lot of things you need to do, but I always bring it back to strategy first. Try to understand what are the top 3 biggest problems you're solving for, and how will technology help you in that area. It doesn't necessarily need to be a problem either. It could be an opportunity that you think exists on the market. I think once you have that established, you then have to really understand your buildings and their capabilities. So like I said, don't just try to show up with a platform or a gateway and stick it in the building. Like, actually test it out, see how that works. Are your buildings performing the way that you think they are from a controls network perspective? Because I can tell you what happens when sometimes you show up with a gateway, you stick it in and you end up crashing an entire controls network. But yeah, for me, it's understanding your buildings and understanding what it is that you're trying to solve for and where you're going with this sort of application.
Okay. Chan, when you were getting started with this, what were some of your first steps? How did you get some buy-in from others around the organization? Because you've had the twin for a couple of years now, and it's been it was brand new technology when it came out, and so I'm curious, what did you do from a buy-in perspective down that road?
I think we try to socialize it as much as possible to all of our stakeholders, people working in the building. try to get them to understand it was a tool that we were kind of using on the IT engineering side, but it's something that could be useful for them as well. One of the use cases we had was because we had the digital twin now and we were opening the building, we're opening into the pandemic year now, but we still needed to train our staff while they were remote from home. So we were able to kind of log into that digital environment and at least give them visually an understanding of how to navigate through the building. And so that was one of the things that we were able to get kind of people on board. It was really difficult for some of our older engineering construction type personalities to come around to this new idea. You know, they just wanted a roll of architectural drawings in a closet somewhere to open. And so trying to get everyone to just kind of understand this, like this new thing that was out that they didn't experience or have no awareness of. So having a lot of working sessions, I think we had working introduction sessions with all of our departments one at a time. And so we first started with our IT and our engineering, then we pushed that out to our guest service team. We're really excited about technology and getting feedback from them on how they would want to see it used, or what they would like to see in it in terms of the capability of the overall asset that we're creating.
And Robby, from a product perspective, from the manufacturer side, if someone's wanting to move down this road, and they call you up, like, what's those first steps that they need to be prepared to have those conversations right out of the gate with you on?
You didn't have to say it, Jeremy. I caught myself.
I didn't say nothing.
I know. Yeah, so this will kind of piggyback off of the answer that David gave around the first steps of finding those use cases and what Chan was talking about getting that buy-in. But we also have to get buy-in from your contractors and from those different disciplines that you need, whether it's gathering documents, gathering those drawings, gathering those O&M manuals. It's really important that we get those. And one of the questions that came through in chat, which was a great question about kind of scalability and what if it's an existing building versus a new build. We can certainly look at existing buildings and create digital twins for existing buildings. It all comes down to, do we have the right level of documentation to enable that use case that you're looking for? So sometimes if you want a very basic use case, say you just want kind of that repository for your O&M manuals, as long as we have those, we don't need the complex live data integrations yet, and we can add those in later on as we go. But certainly the earlier in the process that we can get connected with those contractors, whether they're, again, on the static data side, so the drawings and the manuals, or if they're on the live data side, so working with the BMS provider, working with the energy metering provider, then we can kind of build that DNA, weave that digital twin DNA in that early on in the process, so that we're getting sent the copies of those. We're getting front-end access to the systems that we need front-end access to, so that we can bring that data in successfully and easily into the digital twin. If you don't have buy-in from those kind of third-party contractors, then it can be a little bit like pulling teeth for us on our end, and for the customer as well, because you're doing a lot of chasing down of people and trying to get those drawing sets and trying to get that access to those systems. And that can really stretch your timeline out pretty far. But just like the digital twin is scalable up into portfolios of hundreds of buildings or more, it's also scalable down. So you can say, take a twin that's the size of the stadium, which is a huge twin, and we can do it for a much smaller building. Again, it all depends on what kind of use cases you want and what data that you have available.
Right. So it's not just for, say, greenfield new construction. We can use these in brownfield sites, but I think what I'm hearing we're saying is we should really focus on specific use cases and then grow from there, because that's where we're going to get that value, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And if you look at SoFi Stadium, we chose, we had, I think, 25 different systems to choose from that we could potentially pull live data from, right? Everything from connected soap dispensers to, it ran the gamut of different live data streams. And we kind of looked at those systems and chose 10 that we said, okay, these 10 systems, so things like the BMS and the energy metering systems, these will enable the most immediate and the most impactful results and use cases in the end. So that's, we chose those 10, and not only that doesn't preclude us from in the future starting to roll in more of those other systems that we can say, oh, we found some interesting data nuggets here that say, okay, we're monitoring, now we might want to monitor ticket sales, or have an integration to Square so we can monitor people buying souvenirs and stuff, and see, okay, when people park, when do they come into the stadium, when do they buy their cold beverage of choice, and when do they take their seat, and we can start to map that user and that guest experience through the stadium.
Right. Okay. So David, I'd like to toss one over to you around data security. So a question came through the chat around data storage and capability and access and cyber. It really kind of hones around cybersecurity and data integrity. What's the approach Oxford is taking towards addressing this specific item?
Yeah, I think there is also a question of on-prem versus off-prem in there as well.
Yep.
I can answer, how we're approaching it, but I think it's important to think more broadly as well about it. You really have to understand what your approach is going to be to this. It is possible to have a completely cloud-based solution. It's possible to have an on-prem solution, and it's possible to have a hybrid solution. What I can say is, when you look at what this digital twin is going to be, assuming that you're going with a cloud-based approach, you have technology that's extracting data from buildings and potentially sending control signals back. So from a cybersecurity point of view, that is a big red flag. If you talk to any cyber people, they will say the same. I think it's very important to sort of nail down what the requirements for this is, document it, and get your cybersecurity colleagues or third-party vendors who specialize in cyber to review this along the way. Because the last thing you want to do is blindly implement or select and implement a technology that one day introduces a big risk into the organization. That can absolutely kill this sort of program. So our approach has been to socialize with the relevant colleagues, get them on board from day one, have them review it, have them put input into the design. That way, when it's ready to go, everybody's signed off on it. I think the other aspect too, in looking at this, is not only cyber, but privacy. Are you going to be collecting PII data, personally identifiable information? For the most part, if you're collecting telemetry data, that's not PII, but you never know. You might be integrating with a video camera that's pulling in live data. Can you run analytics on that to identify who a person is, or align that with access control data? So I think there's a lot of considerations there, but again, it all comes back to what are you building and what are you trying to do? What's the outcome?
So, and Chan, as it relates to cyber and Willow being a SaaS platform, how did you and Willow kind of address the cyber component to ensure that we weren't going to have any issues around whether it was penetration or integrity or just down that road?
Luckily, I wasn't part of the cyber side. Our IT was, so I'm not well equipped to answer where we were with our firewalls and the different steps that our IT team took to address that issue. But they did work with Robby, so maybe Robby can elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure, and obviously security is one of the huge aspect of SoFi Stadium. SoFi hosted the Super Bowl this past year, hosting the college football playoffs this coming year, FIFA World Cup, Olympics, the list goes on. So, without getting too specific, Willow is hosted on a separate VM that a virtual machine that allows us to have access to the data that we need and nothing that we don't. The other big thing is we don't do any command and control through the Willow platform at this site. So what that means is right now we're not enabling direct control through the Willow platform of key elements of, say, the building management software. And that's another key piece of kind of digital twins is I think that really stands as a demarcation line of how you use the twin. Is, are you saying, okay, am I using this as a tool, like a diagnostic tool that's telling me what is going on in my building and maybe what are some actions I can do to increase my operational efficiency or reduce energy consumption, versus can I actually take the measure? Am I actually taking those measures in the software to to control those systems in the building? And that's definitely something you want to work out as you're going through your own digital twin journey, is how do you plan to address command and control? And there's obviously a huge security risk and security considerations that need to kind of come into play when you cross that line from a software that's just providing the information and access to your data and access to those insights versus a software platform that's providing that command and control.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like there was a very a direct process for how Willow was going to interface with that information, and that went through all of those cyber reviews. And they
Right.
said, okay, because of X, Y, and Z, we're going to do this.
Mhm.
And so our list of use cases went from 20 to 17, right?
Right.
So that kind of a scenario, but still knowing that 17 was still worth the value to keep everything moving forward. So, and I think to answer that question for everybody is to tie into what SoFi has done and what David is doing is bring in your partners. Don't blindly just implement something. Bring those partners to the table. Bring them to the table early. Have those conversations and incorporate their feedback into the overall design. So that is absolutely one that should never be overlooked. An interesting one came in here towards the end of what are some of the softer, more intangible things that you guys have seen from having a twin? So we all know the fault detection, energy management, running after 10-15% savings, operational efficiencies. What are some of the more unique things that you have been able to identify as part of that process? David, how about for Oxford?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to the sort of metrics we look at, comfort is one, wellness, do you see an improvement in those? Do you see a reduction in hot cold calls? We have a platform called 310 Max that our tenants can call into if there's an issue in the building. So, ideally, if you're making adjustments to the building and looking at the data from the twin, you should be seeing a reduction in calls that come in. I'd say, just based on my experience too, as you get your colleagues and sites kind of trained up on this, you start to see greater sophistication around what they can do over the years, which is great to see. You see greater adoption of this. And that's one of the biggest sort of rewarding factors for me. It's just seeing a portfolio that's shifting towards a more intelligent way of operating. I'd say if you can do this properly, ultimately, if you can drive new revenue streams through some of the digital capabilities you're building, that's golden. It's one thing to reduce costs, but if you can create actual dollars from this, figure out a way to do that effectively, that's a huge win, I'd say. We're not quite there yet, but I think that's what the future is for us.
Okay. Chan, what have you guys seen the little the minor things that have come up?
The interest in it in regards to like a production team coming in, concert, sponsors, being able to use just the visual asset of it, the visualization tool for them has been really helpful. Some of the things that we do when we're trying to solve, like I think the other day I just took a screen clip of of all of our HVAC, our sewage vent overlays, and provided it to our team over at the YouTube theater, just so they understood, the complexity of the plumbing and the air in that space, so that, they knew the difficulty of trying to solve some of the things that we're experiencing within, the space itself during a show or whatnot. So those little things that we didn't think people would be interested in, that are interested in. The biggest use case is just using the tool to measure widths and heights in spaces when someone wants to build a stage or have an art installation. Just a quick reference to just open up the twin and then just take a measurement there, and then we'll do a measurement in the field after, but just the conversational piece in terms of when we're talking to people that are normally not using that technology. Those areas of interest, I guess, what have been beneficial for us.
Okay. And Robby, with the other clients that Willow has, is there any unique items that you can bring out that that are a little more of the softer side?
Sure. A lot of it, and David kind of mentioned it around the people aspect, but if you go back to the famous JLL 300 rule of, for every square foot in a building, you're spending $3 on the energy, 30 on the space, and 300 on the people that are in that space. And I think it's even been expanded to 3,000, which is the marketing value of that space, right? So the brand image, and that's really what we try for at SoFi is, if they're going for being the most technologically advanced stadium in the world, then we want the digital twin to be that backbone. That's, when you walk in as a guest into that stadium, it's not just, you're not seeing everything that's going on behind the scenes, but you're getting a good experience. The finishes of everything are everything's being well maintained, that the right stuff is clean when it needs to be. And so we're looking at how do we use the digital twin to make sure that we're influencing that guest experience. So you're influencing that 300 and 3,000 part of that equation of the brand around the stadium and the guest experience. So, and that can certainly be extended to tenants in a building. The cost of retraining people, and everyone knows that with retention rates and everything, it's way better to be able to retain an employee. And if the building comfort and the lighting levels and the noise levels and the CO2 concentrations, all that can contribute to an employee's comfort, then and increase their likelihood to stay, then you're going to save thousands of dollars that are really hard to calculate in any ROI calculator. But it does have a major impact on a company's bottom line.
And so, that brings kind of a great point here. And I know we've got about a few minutes left here, and I'm going to tee off on a question. Hopefully we could get through this before the end. So everybody's hearing about a lot of the benefits, but now we get to some of the harder questions, and that's what's it going to cost for an organization to implement a digital twin, because those costs can vary, right? Depending on how many are we going to do? 5 use cases, 2 use cases? Are we going to use a platform for document repository, or are we going to use it for 15, 20 different use cases? So if we're talking about how to get started and budgeting around digital twins, David, maybe start with you. Like, what kind of guidance can we give others who are interested in going down that road?
Yeah, I hate to be the outlier here, but I might take a different approach to answering your question.
Sure.
I'd say a lot of people look at what's the cost of the technology in doing this. I would also say, think about what's the cost of not doing it. Look at your operations, look at where the waste is. Can you afford to not go down this path? What I would say is, if you do go down this path, you should be committed to it. And for Oxford, that meant having a team internally, myself and my team of 2 specialists, as well as different vendors and consultants who are willing to go along this journey with us. What I would say is for traditional real estate, if the cost of this technology is so expensive that it cannot be borne by the individual sites, you've lost. So I don't want to give a specific number, but if this costs more than, let's say, 50,000 on the high end on an ongoing basis for the average building, you're not likely to get buy-in. So generally, the lower the cost, the better. But I'd also say, going back to one of my points and being able to demonstrate value, it's not just enough to get this in and have the organization pay for it. If you're able to quantify what you're finding in terms of value, that just helps to create the business case there as well.
All right. And Chan, when you were socializing this as part of the strategy and implementation, did costs come up as part of that conversation? And if so, knowing about the level of variability that's there, how did you address that?
The overall project cost, or the overall cost when we were, I think it's it's going to be different for everyone, and it's going to be, as David mentioned, you have to think about what you want it to do and what you want it for first, and that'll determine how much it's how much of the expense that you're going to take on and what journey you're trying to take based on the initial research that you're doing and what you want to do. I mean, for us, we wanted the first phase was to have a digital twin, right? And we knew that it was going to be a static model in the beginning. And then our second phase was to incorporate some of these systems that we have incorporated. And then in phase 3, how we wanted to be customizable in the future. And that's where we decided, what those costs were going to be working with Willow. But I think that answer is going to be, different for everyone that's taking this approach. I mean, you want a car, but what do you want your car to do? If you wanted to go off-road, you might not want to get a Prius, right? And so those are the kind of things that you have to ask yourself and your organization in regards to, you want a twin, but what do you want it to do? And then you can kind of figure out what that cost or that capital project is going to be for you.
All right, perfect. And we'll go one question left for everybody, and see if we can try to cap this into a minute here. So Robby, I'll start with you. What are the areas of success, and what are the challenges as it relates to digital twins in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, areas of success around the data ontology and data tagging schema, and being able to layer in this metadata that gives you so much more insight around your assets. It's not just a static thing in a building anymore. You have all sorts of places, people that it's affecting, and other systems that are connected to it. So the insights around that data ontologies are really exciting right now. Where we're heading in the future and the challenges is how do we integrate it into these broad use cases like ESG and like sustainability. They're really big buzzwords right now, but just like a digital twin, it's a different definition depending on who you're talking to. So how do we build a twin that is useful, that contains good information for people who are trying to pull out these use cases related to sustainability? I think is a huge, really exciting challenge for us. And again, I think it comes back to starting with the good building blocks of solid data model, solid ontology, and working with the people who are going to be using the tool to make sure they know how to use it to get what they need out of it. All
right. Chan, how about for you? What are the areas for success and challenge in the next 3 to 5 years?
Understanding and knowing that, once you start it, that you have to really continue to pay attention to it, to be committed to it. It's not something that starts and ends. It starts and then it just keeps going, and then you have to really kind of grow with it, as well as it grow with you depending on, what you're doing in the facility at the time. Our facility is always changing. I mean, I think we started renovating spaces as soon as we started using the space, after commissioning and turnover. So you can't always plan for how the facility is going to function or plan to use, especially in our case, with people going in and out, different events, different aspects of how we utilize the physical space. We always have to continually modify the physical space, but understanding that once you start this project, it's a continuous project.
All right. And David, last thought on success and challenges for twins in the next 3 to 5 years.
So for me, success comes down to adoption throughout the industry, widespread adoption. When you start to see, architects, design engineers, vendors kind of shift to a more digital approach, but designing and operating and maintaining buildings, that to me is success, not just internal adoption within organizations. The challenges, I think, broadly are just integrating to buildings. There doesn't seem to be a standard around specifying infrastructure or systems such that, these sorts of platforms and technologies are truly plug and play. But I think if we get to more acceptance of this, that's going to drive those standards. And ultimately, one day in the future, buildings will be plug and play. You just walk up, connect to it, data is going to flow. I think for me, that's what success looks like, but it's also a very big challenge at the moment.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. I hope this gave you a little extra insight into digital twins, what they really are, what they're not. And thank you to Chan. Thank you, Robby. Thank you, Dave, for attending to be panelists today. And thank you to the Smart Building Exchange for setting up this session. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.